We saw in the last lecture that Jesus was not well received during his public ministry. He was rejected by some of the villages and towns he visited during his preaching. He was spurned by people from his hometown, and he was rejected even by his own family. Moreover, he entered into a number of hard-hitting disputes with other Jewish teachers of the law, especially those who were Pharisees. As I've indicated, though, it was not these disputes that ultimately led to Jesus' demise. Instead, it was the controversy that he stirred up when he went to Jerusalem during the last week of his life, during a Passover celebration, where he raised the ire of the power players among his people, who decided to have him removed from the public eye as a troublemaker. As we'll see, the historical events surrounding Jesus' last days are best understood in light of his own apocalyptic message. It's important to any reconstruction of the historical Jesus to make sense of the connection between the content of his message and the reason for his death. This is a major principle that one needs to apply in thinking about reconstructions of the historical Jesus. Some hypotheses of what Jesus ultimately stood for run aground on just this connection. They often sound completely plausible in their reconstruction of what Jesus said and did, but they can't make sense of his execution by the Romans. There needs to be a plausible connection between what Jesus did in his ministry and what happened to him at the end. If, for example, Jesus is to be understood as, say, a Jewish rabbi who simply taught that everyone should love God and be good to one another, why did the Romans crucify him? It wasn't a crime to teach love and kindness. Or if Jesus was mainly interested in opposing the materialistic world that he found himself in, urging his followers to give up their possessions, to live simple, natural lives apart from the trappings of society, why would he have been sentenced to death? It wasn't a capital offense to share your goods with others. Let me explain here at the outset of this lecture, in a nutshell, how I understand the connection between Jesus' life and his death. In this lecture, and the next one then, I'll unpack some of the details. What is the connection, though, between how I portrayed Jesus in his public ministry and the reasons for his execution by the Romans? In a nutshell, at the end of his life, Jesus brought his apocalyptic message of the coming judgment to Jerusalem. This judgment, he declared, would be inflicted by the Son of Man, who would destroy all those who were opposed to God before establishing God's kingdom. Those who refused to accept this message were to be condemned. Even if they, like the Pharisees, followed the Torah of God to the T, or maintained the purity regulations of the Essenes, or remained faithful to the sacrificial cult of the temple promoted by the Sadducees. In fact, religious leaders among these various groups and the institutions they represented would be destroyed at the coming of the Son of Man. So too would the temple itself. Jesus not only preached this message upon arriving in Jerusalem, he acted it out, entering into the temple and engaging in a kind of symbolic action of destruction as a warning of what was to come, overturning some of the tables and causing a mild ruckus. This public display and its accompanying message angered some of the chief priests on the scene, who recognized how explosive the situation could become during the Passover, given the tendency of the celebration to become a silent protest that could always erupt into something far worse, as we've seen in a previous lecture. Fearing a possible uprising, the priests conferred with one another, had Jesus arrested, and questioned him about his words against the temple. Realizing that it would be dangerous to let him run loose, they decided to have him taken out of the way. They could not handle the matter themselves, however, because the Romans did not allow Jewish authorities to execute criminals. And so they delivered him over to the governor, Pontius Pilate, who had no qualms at all about disposing of yet one more troublemaker who might cause a major disturbance. Jesus was then executed by the Romans on political charges. For such information about Jesus' last days, we're better informed than for any other period of his life. For the gospel writers, Jesus' life was by and large a preparation for his death. Thus, the focus of these earliest surviving accounts, our canonical Gospels, is on Jesus' last days. And so we have more information about this than anything else. The Gospel of Mark devotes 5 of his 16 chapters just to the final week of Jesus' life. The Gospel of John devotes 10 out of 21 chapters to this last week. It's no stretch to say that the Gospels are principally concerned about Jesus' passion, that is, the accounts of his suffering and death. Or, as some scholars have put it, the Gospels are passion narratives with long introductions. And so we have a lot more information. I've now given you the brief overview of how I understand the connection between Jesus' life and his death, with the emphasis that you need to see what this connection is in any reconstruction of Jesus, or else you need to see whether somebody makes the connection, or else the reconstruction itself won't be plausible. Now, I want to enter into more detail in the play-by-play in the rest of this lecture and then the one to come. First, there can be no doubt, historically, that for the last week of Jesus' life, he left the place of his public ministry, rural Galilee, and went with his disciples to the capital city of Judea, Jerusalem. This is the only reliable account we have of Jesus going to a major urban setting, into Jerusalem. What's not particularly clear or obvious is why Jesus did so, why he went to Jerusalem for the last week of his life. A theologian, of course, might say that he did this because he knew that it was time for him to die for the sins of the world. This view, though, that a theologian might have, is based on gospel sayings that cannot pass our criterion of dissimilarity, namely the predictions that Jesus gives, that he must go to Jerusalem because he has to be rejected by the scribes and elders and be crucified and then raised from the dead. He makes this prediction 3 times, for example, in the Gospel of Mark. But the prediction clearly cannot pass our criterion of dissimilarity, since it portrays Jesus as being fully cognizant of the details of his own fate. Jesus may have anticipated what was going to happen to him, as we'll see later, but these specific passion predictions simply can't pass our criteria. Are there historical reasons for thinking Jesus might have gone to Jerusalem, apart from the theological perspective, restricting ourselves to what we can show just on historical grounds? Well, we should remember that the Passover feast was an enormously popular festival among the Jews. Celebrated annually, it was a time for Jews from all over the world to come to Jerusalem to commemorate the Exodus under Moses that God had accomplished, as recounted in the book of Exodus. Maybe Jesus, like so many other Jews, went to Jerusalem simply to celebrate the Passover feast. I think that's a plausible explanation. He was a pilgrim, like so many others. On the other hand, Jesus' actions in Jerusalem, once he arrives, appear to have been well thought out. It appears that he had something else going on. When he arrived, he entered into the temple and caused a disturbance. He then spent several days in the temple teaching his message of the coming kingdom, according to our earliest accounts. And we'll talk about more detail later. Given Jesus' understanding that the kingdom was imminent, perhaps it's best to conclude that he went to Jerusalem as part of his mission of proclamation, precisely in order to proclaim this message in the heart of Israel itself, in the temple, in Jerusalem, on the Passover. In other words, Jesus came to the temple to tell his people how the future salvation would occur and to urge them to prepare for it by repenting of their sins and accepting his teachings. that would explain why he went to Jerusalem. Not just to celebrate the Passover, but in order to bring his urgent message to the heart of Israel. The account of Jesus' so-called triumphal entry into Jerusalem is hard to accept historically. The account is multiply attested, but it does not pass the criterion of dissimilarity. The earliest account we have of Jesus entering into Jerusalem for the Passover feast is, of course, found in the Gospel of Mark. According to Mark's account, Jesus sends out a couple of his disciples to find a colt for him to ride into Jerusalem on, and they get a colt that he directed them towards. They bring him to Jesus, and then they throw their cloaks on this colt, and Jesus sits on it. And then he rides into Jerusalem. Many people spread their cloaks on the road. Others spread leafy branches they've cut down in the fields. You get the image of people kind of lining the streets and laying down their garments and palm branches in front of Jesus so that he can tread on them going into Jerusalem. Then those who went ahead and those who followed were shouting, "Hosanna! Blessed is the one who comes into the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. Hosanna in the highest heaven." A grand triumphal entry of the king into Jerusalem. It's a spectacular scene, but it's really hard to accept because it seems to presuppose faith in Jesus as the Messiah by the Jewish crowds, a faith that the later gospel writers, of course, would want to highlight. In other words, it would be quite similar to what Christians would want to say about Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. In one of the early accounts that found in the Gospel of Matthew, we're told that this coming into Jerusalem actually fulfills a prophecy. Matthew tells us this took place to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophets, saying, "Tell the daughter of Zion, look, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, and on a colt, the foal of a donkey." This is a quotation of Zechariah chapter 9. It's interesting, by the way, in Matthew's gospel, who quotes this verse that the king will come on a donkey and on a colt, the foal of a donkey. This is a Hebrew parallelism in the Hebrew Bible, where in the Psalms and other poetry, the way they write the poetry is they'll have one line that'll say something, then the second line will say the same thing in different words. A donkey on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Matthew apparently didn't understand that was what was going on in this prophecy in Zechariah. According to Matthew, what happens is there are actually two animals, a donkey and a colt, and the disciples bring both of them to Jesus. They spread their cloaks over them, and Jesus kind of straddles the two of them and rides into Jerusalem, them kind of straddling these two, so as to literally to fulfill this prophecy of Zechariah, which sounds even somewhat more implausible. One of the reasons for thinking this account didn't really happen is because of the issue of contextual credibility. What we know of the political situation in Jerusalem during the Passover makes it very difficult to accept that Jesus entered into Jerusalem this way. As we've seen, the week before Passover was tense and a dangerous time in view of the Roman authorities. As we've seen, this was the one time of the year when the Roman governor would bring troops from Caesarea and station them around town, especially around the temple, in order to quell any possible uprisings of the people. If Jesus actually did enter into the city with such fanfare, with crowds shouting their support for him as the new ruler of the Jews, the king who fulfills all prophecies, who would therefore have to overthrow the present ruler and his armies in order for himself to rule, it's nearly impossible to understand why the authorities didn't have him arrested on the spot and immediately taken away, if this really happened. Probably the most we can say historically is that Jesus actually did enter into Jerusalem, that he was one of the pilgrims coming for the feast, and it may be that he, like others, rode into town on a donkey. It's also possible that later people looking back on it thought of this as the triumphal entry of the king into his city, but that at the time it didn't really look that way to many most people. It is possible, though, that some people of the crowds in Jerusalem had already heard about this teacher from Galilee, and possibly they had hopes. Maybe this will be somebody who will be able to do something for us. Maybe even wondered aloud, could this be our future deliverer? And so that's possible. There would have been nothing implausible about people speculating such things. We know of Jews, both before Jesus' day and afterwards, who were thought to be some kind of future leader of the nation of Israel. Typically, such people who were thought to be a future leader were handled rather harshly by the Roman authorities. The instances we know about, these people were executed, as of course was Jesus. One of the most solidly established traditions about Jesus is what deals with what happened after he arrived in Jerusalem. Namely, that he caused a disturbance in the temple, driving out those who sold animals and overturning the tables of the money changers. Again, the earliest account is found in the Gospel of Mark, right after the scene of the triumphal entry in Mark chapter 11. We're told that he comes into Jerusalem, he enters into the temple, he drives out those who sell and those who are buying in the temple. He overturns the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. He would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. He was teaching and saying, is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you've made it a den of robbers. We're told then that the chief priests and the scribes heard it, and they started looking for a way to kill him. It's a very interesting account. Jesus causing a ruckus in the temple. To understand the account, we need a little bit of background information. And so let me say a few words about what was going on in the temple at the time. First, the temple itself. The temple was an enormous place. As I indicated earlier, the walls around the temple were 10 stories high. They encompassed a space that was large enough to hold 25 American football fields. We're talking about an enormous place. It was a glorious place, built with the finest materials available, much of it overlaid with gold. This was the one place where Jews from around the world could come to sacrifice animals to God, as prescribed by the Torah. Jews believed that God himself dwelt in the temple. There was an inner room, the Holy of Holies, a room that was completely empty, except that God's presence was believed to dwell there in the temple. And so sacrifices were made there in close proximity to God himself. Jews were commanded to sacrifice animals to God. The Passover feast, as we've seen, required Jews to sacrifice lambs in the temple. They couldn't sacrifice them in their homes or someplace else. They had to be sacrificed in the temple. The problem is that Jews were coming from all over the world to the temple in order to make these sacrifices. They obviously couldn't bring their lambs with them if they're traveling from Alexandria, Egypt, or from Asia Minor, or from Rome or someplace. They can't just load the animals up on their shoulders and start walking. And so obviously for the temple to work, people had to be able to purchase animals on the spot. It wouldn't make sense, though, for people to purchase animals using imperial coinage, because the imperial coinage had an image of Caesar on it. And so there was a kind of currency exchange set up where people could exchange their imperial money for temple currency that didn't have images on it, and use the temple money then to buy the animals that they were going to sacrifice. It's hard to see how the temple could function without some kind of system like this. Jews had to sacrifice, and so there was really no alternatives that one could think of. Our early accounts, though, indicate that Jesus entered into the temple, and he drove out those who were selling sacrificial animals, and he overturned the tables of the money changers. It's hard to know historically what Jesus actually did when he entered the temple and what he meant by it. Most scholars recognize that some aspects of our accounts, even though something like this must have happened because it's so widely attested in our sources, most scholars recognize that some aspects of it appear to have been exaggerated. This is particularly true, for example, of Mark's claim, where Mark says that Jesus did not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. Now, how exactly did Jesus do that? Recall the size of this place. how could Jesus shut down the operation of the temple? You can't be sacrificing animals, by the way, if you can't be carrying implements through the temple. Sacrificial knives, for example, or bowls to capture the blood in, or vessels to carry the skins of the animals. You can't function as a temple without carrying vessels. But this says that Jesus stopped the whole thing. Well, maybe it's a miracle, although the account doesn't claim it's a miracle. Maybe then it's just an exaggeration. Moreover, another reason for thinking it's an exaggeration is just the historical realities. If Jesus had actually created an enormous stir in the temple, it's nearly impossible again to explain why he wasn't arrested on the spot and taken out of the way before he could stir up the crowds. We know that soldiers are there. Why didn't they arrest him if, in fact, he caused such a huge disturbance? Well, exaggerations aside, it's almost certain that Jesus did something that caused at least a minor disturbance in the temple. For example, maybe he overturned some tables and made at least a bit of a ruckus that then was exaggerated by later Christians recounting the event. As I've pointed out, the event is multiply attested in our independent sources. Moreover, the account coincides with the predictions that Jesus makes about the temple, that it's going to be destroyed, that we looked at in an earlier lecture. So what's really going on here? A number of years ago, back in the 1970s, a prominent New Testament scholar named E.P. Sanders wrote an influential book, Jesus and Judaism, in which he took a stand on this issue that has become influential among scholars ever since. Sanders claimed that what was going on is that Jesus' actions in the temple represented a kind of symbolic expression of his proclamation, a symbolic expression of his proclamation. Jesus, of course, sometimes engaged in symbolic acts that illustrated his apocalyptic message. He associates with tax collectors and sinners. Why? To illustrate that such people will enter into the kingdom. In view of Jesus' overarching message of the coming destruction when the Son of Man arrives, perhaps it's best then to see Jesus' action in the temple as a kind of prophetic gesture, an enacted parable in which he demonstrated on a small scale what was soon going to happen in a big way on the coming day of judgment. The temple was going to be destroyed, and Jesus then kind of showed this through a small little act of some kind. If that's what's going on, it's still hard to know exactly what Jesus found to be offensive about the temple. For example, whether he thought that the priests who operated in the temple were corrupt. In the words I quoted from Mark, he seems to indicate that the temple itself had grown corrupt, but this may be a Christianization of what Jesus said by his later followers who were telling the stories. On the other hand, we do have accounts of other Jews, both before Jesus and afterwards, who believed that the temple had grown corrupt. For example, the Essenes in the Dead Sea Scroll community thought this, and in the Hebrew Bible, the prophet Jeremiah thought this. It may be that Jesus thought the temple was corrupt, or it may be that Jesus, as a country fellow from rural Galilee, who had been preaching against wealth and power, simply saw the temple and the sheer opulence of the place made his blood boil on principle. It's possible. There are a couple of ways to understand the significance of Jesus' prediction that the temple was going to be destroyed in light of his broader apocalyptic message. What is Jesus exactly thinking? You see, the problem is, since God commanded that there be a temple and told Jews what to sacrifice there, and that's what the Jews are doing, why is Jesus opposing it? Well, there are a couple ways to understand it. One way, it may be that Jesus believed that in this coming kingdom of God that he's proclaiming, there would be a new temple, one that was totally sanctified for the worship of God. In other words, he may have thought that this temple had become corrupt because of the wicked priests who were running it, but that in the kingdom of God coming, there'd be a new temple after this old one was destroyed. That kind of view is represented by other Jews we know about from the day. Apocalyptically minded Essenes of the Dead Sea Scroll community thought something very similar to that. Another option is that Jesus may have believed that in the future coming kingdom there would be no need of a temple at all. In this future kingdom there'd be no more evil, no more sin, and therefore there'd be no need for the cultic sacrifice of animals to bring atonement for sins. This was the point of view that was later embraced by some of Jesus' own followers, including the author of the book of Revelation in the New Testament, Revelation chapter 21, verse 22. There'll be no need for a future temple in the coming kingdom. In either case, the implication of Jesus' actions would have been clear. For Jesus, the temple cult and the officials in charge of it were a temporary measure at best and a corruption of God's plan at worst. They would soon be done away with when the kingdom of God arrived. Mark's account is clear that Jesus' actions against the temple and his predictions did not escape the notice of those who were in charge of the temple, the chief priests, who not only had jurisdiction over local affairs of the people of Jerusalem, but also were the principal liaisons with the Roman officials. These priests were by and large members of the Sadduceic party. After Jesus does this, in Mark's gospel at least, he begins to enter into controversy with Sadducees, the chief priests, and as we saw, they start looking for ways to have him removed from the public eye. Jesus appears to have spent the week prior to Passover then, teaching and engaging with his opponents in the temple. It's striking that his most explicitly apocalyptic message is said to have been delivered there in all three of our earliest Gospels. The Jewish authorities begin to be concerned about an uprising in these accounts as the crowd starts swelling and Jesus begins to attract more attention. For their part, Roman authorities were armed and ready to act. It was decided then to have Jesus taken out of the public eye by stealth so as to avoid any problems. We're told in our accounts that prior to being arrested, Jesus had some kind of last meal with his disciples. According to the earliest accounts of Mark and Matthew and Luke, this was a Passover meal. That Jesus at this meal took the symbolic foods that represented the struggles of the children of Israel against the Egyptians, unleavened bread, they would also eat herbs, the lamb, they'd have several cups of wine, that Jesus took the symbolic foods and brought new symbolism to them, taking the bread and saying, "This bread is my body that is broken," taking the cup saying, "This is the new covenant in my blood." It's hard to see that the precise words at the Last Supper are authentic. It's hard to say that because they don't pass the criterion of dissimilarity. Jesus is saying that his own death is going to bring in the new covenant with God. That's something certainly the Christians believed after the fact. It is striking that these words are multiply attested. They're found also in the writings of the Apostle Paul, who says that Jesus said something like this. There's one thing that Jesus says in the passage in Mark, though, that does seem to pass the criterion of dissimilarity. Jesus says in Mark's gospel, after he gives the cup and says, "This is the new covenant in my blood," he says that he would not drink wine again until he drinks it anew in the kingdom. That seems to assume that the kingdom is going to come right away. In other words, the next time Jesus drinks isn't going to be 3,000 years later, but it's going to be very soon. It seems to presuppose the nearness of the kingdom. Even though the gospel writers knew that decades later it hadn't come yet, that would suggest that Jesus maybe actually said something like that, which might suggest that Jesus knew what was going to happen. There'd be nothing implausible at all about his realizing that he was going to be arrested and that he was in trouble. He probably knew that the authorities were against him, and he probably knew what happened to prophets in Jerusalem who opposed the ruling authorities. They were, in virtually every instance, arrested and either punished or executed in other ways. Punished in other ways or executed. It's difficult to know, though, how Jesus actually phrased his coming arrest, since, as we've seen, his passion predictions in the Gospels are so much like the early Christian preaching about Jesus that Christians may have put those predictions on his lips. In conclusion, we can say that Jesus' apocalyptic message can make sense of what happened to him at the end. He brought his message of the impending judgment of God and the imminent arrival of the Son of Man to the heart of Jerusalem during the Passover. He acted out his message of the coming destruction by causing a disturbance in the temple, and this attracted the attention of the authorities in charge of the temple. After a few days, when Jesus was starting to draw more crowds to hear him preach, the authorities decided that they needed to remove him from the public eye.